Okay, well, I think we'll probably start on the dot. This is being recorded, so for those of you who come later, you'll be able to catch up on the beginning. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Shamil Chandaria, who you'll see, both of you who are here in person, but also those online. Shamil has been thinking about eudaimonia for the longest time, and he also has a very strong background in both physics, mathematics, and computer science, and neuroscience in general. So I thought it was extremely appropriate that Shamil would give the first talk in this seminar series at the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing. One of the great things I think that Shamil is able to do is to give an explanation that sort of reaches across the many disciplines. And I think one of the key things about the center is that we should be able to talk to each other across boundaries, and I think this is exactly what Shamil brings along. So Shamil will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat or wait for the end to ask them. I'll gather those, and then hopefully we can have a really quite exciting discussion. So please, Shamil.
All right, well, welcome everyone online. It's a tremendous honor to give this inaugural seminar for the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing. So we're going to be talking about eudaimonia and human flourishing, and what we're going to do is take a through line all the way from Aristotle to a kind of modern conception of eudaimonia. It's going to be mostly based around the philosophical through line. There won't be the normal equations that you see in my talks this time, but I want to try to make the connections with a contemporary view of psychology and neuroscience as well. So the first thing that we need to think about is, what is this word eudaimonia? Eudaimonia, it comes from a good or well spirit, but that's not very helpful. How do we translate this word? Traditionally, eudaimonia has been translated as happiness, but that's not really a very good definition, partly because we use the word happiness in a modern context quite differently from what was used even a few hundred years ago. It is not really a subjective state of mind alone. So other words are something like welfare, or human welfare, or human well-being. What constitutes human well-being? Human fulfillment is another synonym. And I particularly like human flourishing because I think it really captures what Aristotle had in mind. And for Aristotle, the highest human good was eudaimonia. That was the end of our actions, the final purpose of our actions. So a eudaimon life, a good life, he thought was a life that is doing well and living well. And I think that captures the sense of eudaimonia quite well. It is doing well and living well, whatever that means. So let's take a look at Aristotle's conception of human flourishing. And the best way to start is to think about what constitutes the flourishing of plants. And Aristotle's idea is that what constitutes the flourishing of plants is their nature, their biology. And a plant will flourish when it transforms the sun, rain, and nutrients into strong, healthy stalks, luscious leaves, and bright, attractive flowers teeming with pollen. In other words, the most that a plant can be. And so the idea is that the plant will flourish when it uses its natural capacities well, when it fulfills its potential, using its capacities well. And similarly, a human being will flourish if they exercise their human capacities well. And what is using your human capacities well? Using them excellently, like a virtuoso. And the word excellence in this case is the ancient Greek was arete, and the Latin translation is virtuas, which is where we get virtue. So using your capacities like a virtuoso is exactly right. That is, using them with virtues. But what are the human capacities? We need a model of what human nature is. And we need a model of the human soul or the human psyche or the human mind. And for that, we need to go back to where Aristotle got his model from, which is really from Plato. So the major innovator in terms of the model of the human soul was Plato. And Plato conceived of the soul as having parts. And this was a major innovation because Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, considered the human soul was a single, unified thing. But Plato, as in his middle years, really went against Socrates and realized intuitively that the soul has parts. We're pulled. Our reason is pulled by our appetites and our spirits. And here you see a wonderful depiction by Plato. This analogy comes from Plato of a charioteer trying to control a chariot with two horses, and one horse represents the appetite, appetitive part of the soul, and the other horse represents the spirited part of the soul, of which courage, for example, could be a part of that spirited part. And the charioteer is reason, and the role of reason is to try to control desire and spirit, and he has a tough time. So let's look at the fundamental argument in Plato's greatest work, the Republic. And in the Republic, Plato paints this picture of what is the picture of unhappiness. And for him, the picture of unhappiness is illustrated in this Ship of Fools, Hieronymus Bosch painting, which is a picture of psychic disharmony, where reason and appetites and spirit are all in war, and everyone's trying to control the ship. Now, for Plato, the wise person, the happy person, the person who Aristotle would call, saying, would have eudaimonia, would cultivate virtues, and each virtue controls a part of the soul. So the virtue of reason would be wisdom. The virtue of desire would be self-control. The virtue of spirit would be courage. And justice is a virtue that sits in between these parts of the soul, these parts of the mind, and represents the three parts living in harmony. So the basic idea in the Republic is that if you have virtue, you have psychic harmony. And with psychic harmony, you allow reason to deliberate well and choose wise actions for the soul as a whole. And then your life is filled with actions that are most conducive to flourishing, and that is happiness. So let's look at Aristotle's slightly refined update on Plato's model. So Aristotle reasons from first principles, and he says, look, the mind has a reasoning part and a non-reasoning part, a non-rational part. And the reasoning part has two parts to it. The part that does theoretical reasoning, like logic and mathematics and conceptual reasoning, and the practical reasoning part. And the practical reasoning part tells us what are the right actions and to have. Now, in the non-reasoning part comes the desires and emotions. Now, this part is not quite non-reasoning because it can listen to reason. It's amenable to listen to reason. And this is quite prescient of Aristotle, as we'll come to see. And then, of course, there are parts that are not able to listen to reason, nutritive, locomotive, and other vegetative parts. That shouldn't be perceptive, but vegetative. Now, each part of the soul, of the psyche, has a virtue, just like in Plato. And the virtue of theoretical reason is Sophia, or theoretical wisdom. The virtue of practical reason is phronesis, which is practical wisdom. And that actually is what we, in common terms, would think of as wisdom, knowing the right thing to do at the right time. And then the excellences or virtues of the emotions are the virtues of character, things like self-control, courage, and justice. Justice is sort of what we would normally think of as fairness, and ultimately leads to sort of morality. Now, Aristotle's model of virtues are quite well known, so I'll go through this relatively quickly, but each disposition or part of the emotions, for example, the fear circuitry or pleasure or anger, would have its own virtue. So, for example, the virtue of the fear system would be courage. And when you have too much of this kind of amenability to fear, that would be called recklessness. And when you have too little, it'd be called cowardice. So somehow the virtue of courage is some sort of mean or golden mean between too much and too little. There is a notion, we don't want to take this too literally, because in fact, it's kind of dubious a little bit about all the virtues being a golden mean. But we want to take the message that Aristotle is really giving us here, which is there is an appropriate amount of training for these dispositions. It is right to enjoy pleasure, and that's having self-control. But if you enjoy too much, you become self-indulgent, and if you enjoy too little, you're insensible. Anger, again, would give you even-temperedness, and so on. Now, the most important virtue for Aristotle is practical wisdom. Practical wisdom tells us how to act in complicated situations. So where you don't have the habit of the virtue already ingrained, when something novel comes up. And this is a wonderful quote by Aristotle from the Nicomachean Ethics. Anyone can get angry or give money or spend money. But to do this to the right person, to be angry at the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, in the right way, that is not for everyone. That is not easy. That requires wisdom. So let's look at how this wisdom and these virtues are acquired. And there's a kind of very nice developmental story here that Aristotle wants to give us. We'll start with someone like Homer Simpson, who loves eating donuts. And so let's, rather pejoratively, we'll call this a bad character. It's something, Aristotle's language is very quaint nowadays, but let's just call it a bad character. And he has the wrong aim. he wants the donut. He's aiming to get the donut. And his desires are the wrong thing. He has a desperate craving and desire for donuts, and so he'll eat the donut. Now, the first wheel of development is the teaching or learning of wisdom, to know that in fact, best not to have donuts all day long, because that is not conducive to the good life, to human flourishing. So then you get the next rung on the ladder, which is the weak-willed person, the person with akrasia, which is the ancient Greek word for weak-willed, or incontinence, which is now normally used in a medical terminology instead, but incontinence is the traditional word. And that's the typical case that many of us find ourselves in. We have a good aim, but we want the donut. And so we end up giving into that want and end up eating the donut. But then, through training and slowly managing to train our appetitive part, we slowly end up managing to overcome our desire and actually have some self-control and do the action and not eat the donut. And that finally leads to training of the disposition itself, so that the virtuous character has the right aim, wants the right thing, has the right desires, automatic dispositions, and ends up doing the right thing automatically without the need for self-control. And so this is a very interesting idea, and it's surprisingly prescient in terms of our modern understanding of the neuroscience of emotions. And let's use this to see, in a particular circuitry to do with the fear circuitry. I mean, the fear circuitry is probably the emotion that we understand, possibly the best emotion that we understand so far, the kind of the neurological basis of it. This is sort of work that was done by Joseph Ledoux and others. And we want to see how neuroscience, a modern picture of neuroscience, thinks that fear might work, and how that links to Aristotle's model. So suppose that we see some stimulus. Let's say we're terribly frightened of cats, for example. And that wouldn't be very courageous, to be honest, because, a cat is not a lion. So it's not appropriate for us to be so fearful of cats. So we have this emotional stimulus, and the traditional, the pathway goes from the information goes to the sensory thalamus, and from there's a direct connection to the amygdala. And this direct connection is essentially just a lookup table. It's sort of, last time I saw a cat, I reacted with, in this particular way, with a lot of fear. And so the amygdala just sends a message directly to the hypothalamus, and blood pressure goes up and heart rate goes up, and we get ready to run. Of course, there is the route through the cortex that is the more traditional human route, where we can think through how we react a little bit. It's still relatively automated. Again, if we have the habit or the lack of courage, we will activate the amygdala. And then finally, we have modulation of the amygdala by the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, and which can say, look, when you're fully conscious, you can say, look, I really shouldn't be afraid of cats, because I'm just much bigger than cats and they can't really hurt me. And so you might then calm down your amygdala through these downward facing projections. Now, the automatic habits of which go to the amygdala, both from the cortex and directly, are representing the emotional dispositions that we have. And practical wisdom would be sort of thinking through the matter and saying, this is not really the wise course of action. After all, it shouldn't be so frightening. And so the amygdala can be the pathways, these dispositions that are set up in these circuits can be retrained. And that is that ladder that we talked about from Homer Simpson to the virtuous person, where our habits can be retrained. So it's kind of interesting that this kind of modern picture of the way that emotions work, some of the ideas of Aristotle quite prescient. Now, when we come to think about what is human flourishing, what makes life go well, I mean, this ancient picture, we might think, well, surely it's got it all wrong. I mean, the flourishing life is the pleasurable life, full of happiness. And Aristotle had quite a sophisticated relationship in mind when he thinks about pleasure and the good life. The first thing he wants to do in book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics is dismiss a life that is simply devoted to physical pleasures as vulgar. I mean, he wants to dismiss that kind of life pursuing sensuous pleasures as not really going to be a flourishing life. But he fully acknowledges that pleasure is a deep part of a good life, but it's a complex relationship. And for him, the best pleasure arises as a result of exercising the virtues. So by wise and courageous actions, we can get the highest pleasure. And for him, the pleasures of the contemplative life, the life of the scientist and philosopher and thinker, were the best exercise of human capacities, and so would lead to the highest pleasures. But also the life of the civic life, of being a politician or a soldier, in ancient Athens, this kind of public life would also lead to fine pleasures. And this idea really is picked up by John Stuart Mill, who perhaps was a crypto-Aristotelian, because although Mill is normally thought of as a hedonist philosopher, he also concluded that the highest pleasures are ones that ensue from a virtuous, flourishing life. And Mill advocated that the pursuit of happiness was not a good strategy. Rather, happiness ensues if virtue is pursued. And for Mill, there are different qualities of pleasure. So you can have lower pleasures of hedonism, and then higher pleasures of poetry and exercising the virtues. And there's just this wonderful quote, which makes Mill sound very Aristotelian, really, which is, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, that is because they only know their own side of the question." So he's saying, and the other part of the quote which I missed out, is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And his proof of this, or the reason why he thinks this is correct, is that, look, if you are Socrates or someone who has the higher pleasures, you can judge, whereas and you can be a competent judge. Now, other hedonists also thought that virtues were very important, and it's kind of odd that today we think that Epicurus was this kind of simple-minded hedonist pursuing rich foods and other sensuous pleasures, but in fact he was quite moderate. But he thought that pleasure was the ultimate end of life, and yet he thought that the finest pleasure was a peaceful and tranquil mind, something the Greeks called ataraxia. And the route to having a peaceful and tranquil mind was through the exercise of the virtues. So for him, the virtues were instrumental. So even though he was a hedonist, he again puts virtues at the center of his idea of what the good life is. Now, you might then think that, okay, well, fine about all these virtues, but we know that things like having lots of money and fame and fortune is surely the route to the good life. And Aristotle was quite practical and pragmatic about this. And he agrees that, in fact, external goods like money, health, friendships were necessary for human flourishing, but they weren't sufficient. These externals like money, health, and friendship don't constitute flourishing in themselves, but they were necessary conditions. So consider again the plant. Now, a plant can flourish. A plant flourishes when it uses its vegetative capacities well and produces bright and attractive flowers. And its flourishing consists in the verdant growth. Yet, it cannot flourish without sun, rain, and fertile soil. So those are necessary conditions. So the externals like sun, rain, and fertile soil are necessary without constituting the flourishing itself. And this is an important point for Aristotle. And finally, we have luck, which is sort of connected to externals. And here you see this lovely famous painting of King Priam, the king of Troy, in the Iliad, begging Achilles to release Hector, his son's dead body. And Aristotle considered Priam and said, look, Priam was well respected. He ruled over a flourishing city. He was wise and virtuous. And yet, because of this war with Greece, he lost it all. And so Aristotle's conclusion is that Priam can't be seen as having had a good life, can't be seen as a flourishing individual. So flourishing is not immune from bad luck. So Aristotle takes quite a pragmatic view. But these externals are important, and we must bear them in mind as we go forward. Because the Stoics, who were a school of post-Aristotelian philosophy, disagreed with Aristotle here. And they took a very purist line. And they thought that no, the virtues are sufficient. And in this idea, they actually come closer to Plato's teacher, Socrates, who also thought that the virtues, and specifically wisdom, is sufficient for the good life. So for the Stoics, the virtuous person could be happy even in the most difficult circumstances. So imagine yourself being tortured on the rack, And the Stoics would think that no, the virtuous person can be happy on the rack. Very difficult for us to understand, but the idea is that what wisdom gives us is the key for a good life. And so we have Epictetus, who puts it quite clearly to say that the only thing that is within our power is to choose the judgment of our impressions, of our sensory data. So we get sensory data, but it's up to us how we construe this sensory data. And this choice is called prohairesis. And if we exercise this choice, this perception, this perspective on our reality, on our situation, if we exercise it well, we can maintain equanimity. And so for the Stoics, the very important virtue is this idea of equanimity. And through equanimity, we are essentially immunized by the vagaries of fortune because we can't do anything about it. And this links to their wider philosophy, which is that the wise and virtuous person learns to live according to nature, nature being the laws of nature or the logos. And so part of wisdom is to understand that we are constrained by the physical unfoldings of the universe. And this is kind of reminiscent to the Taoist philosophy flowing with the Tao. And another Stoic philosopher, earlier philosopher, Clynthes, puts it very nicely, has this lovely picture in mind to say the unvirtuous person is like a dog tied to a cart and compelled to go wherever it goes. This dog is dragged about by the cart and is constantly struggling and being pulled along by the cart. But the wise and virtuous will flow with the cart and use the slack in their leash well. So, here we are. Here's the unwise dog. And here is the wise dog who's happily following along the path and, using the slack that it has. And so the Stoics even come to, Stoic wisdom is to come to have an amor fati for your life, which is a love of your fate and to go along. And so the idea is that, in fact, by controlling one's outlook on life and having the virtues and the wisdom to do that, we will come to see that everything is not just okay, but quite amazing. So that was a very brief sketch of Aristotelian philosophy and some post-Aristotelian philosophy. But now let's consider how we can bring these ideas up to date, because a lot has happened in philosophy since the time of Aristotle. So let's look at the question again of what is the good life? What is human well-being? What is human flourishing? What makes life go well? And we've seen a certain type of answer to this question. An objective answer that, look, certain things like, for example, virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, self-control, or external goods, economic, health, friendship, or specific states of mind like pleasure or tranquility, are what makes life go well, are what constitutes human flourishing. But now there's another type of answer to this question. And the way to see that is to look at a very famous question posed by originally Socrates and brought down to us through a Platonic dialogue called the Euthyphro. And paraphrasing, it roughly goes like this. Do I desire X because X is good? Or is X good because I desire it? Now, this is a very interesting question. Do I desire money because it's good, intrinsically good? Or is money good because I desire it? Very interesting. But what we can see is that objective answers that were given by the ancient philosophers, are essentially saying that I should desire virtues, external goods, and specific state of mind because they are intrinsically good. But there is this other type of answer, a subjective answer. And what that says is that, look, it's getting what I want that makes it good. And perhaps not getting what I want, because my wants can be, I might want the donut, but it's getting what I want if I was fully informed, or perhaps getting what I would want to want. So some sort of desiring or counterfactual desires make something is what it is that makes it go well. You can see why it's called subjective, because it depends on what we want. And now there's a sort of third category, which is happiness. Now, actually, happiness is in fact an objective, if you could think of it in two ways. It actually has features of just being. If you think that the good life, what makes life go well, what is human flourishing is just happiness, then you could say, well, it's like an objective thing, but it's just one thing. It's, forget about virtues and forget about all these other things, just happiness as this objective feature that makes life go well. Or you could say it's subjective, because it's going to depend on, from person to person, what gives them happiness. So I'll put it in between. So we've got these three types of answers, and let's develop them a little bit more to see what they would look like in contemporary philosophy. So the first category is desire satisfaction theories of well-being, and this whole taxonomy was put together in a lovely appendix by Derek Parfit in his first book. And desire satisfaction theories are actually quite prevalent in modern thinking, especially amongst many contemporary philosophers and economists today. In fact, the whole of economics is based on preference satisfaction models, with utility curves and indifference curves. But essentially, these kind of theories are that what makes life go well is if my goals and desires are fulfilled, or perhaps we need to modify that to say if my reasonable desires were fulfilled. In other words, ones that I would come to see are worth having, either because I'm informed well, or because they are things that I want to want, or that there are some counterfactual desires under idealized conditions of being cool, calm, and collected. So I may want to punch somebody in the face, but that's because I'm not cool, calm, and collected at the time. The second category of theories about what makes life go well are the hedonistic theories. And this was, this was really started by Jeremy Bentham, who thought that what makes life go well is happiness, and happiness consists in pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And in a modern sense, this could be thought of as a moment-to-moment affective balance. But you might say, well, that's just the sort of moment-to-moment logging of my state of affective balance might not be the right way to do it. Maybe what we're really looking at is happiness as some sort of overall positive emotional state, something like a good mood, something that makes me think, makes me look upon the world in a glass half full way, in an optimistic, consistent, contented, optimistic mood. Something a little bit like the opposite of anxiety and depression. And then you could say, well, that's not even wide enough. Perhaps what we're really looking at is not evaluating our affective state moment to moment or just being in a good mood, but perhaps our cognitive evaluation of how well our life is going, how satisfied are we with our life? You know, what's the shape, overall shape of our life? Do we think that, you know, oh, I've got a good career and a good family life and friends and you know, I've achieved my potential, and so I feel quite satisfied with my life. And that's what constitutes happiness. And in the last few decades, there's a whole science that is trying to measure what we might think of, what is termed as subjective well-being. And Ed Diner composed this measure, which is essentially a composite measure of positive affect, moment-to-moment positive affect minus negative affect plus life satisfaction. So it's just a hybrid measure, and it's been used in psychology to measure these kind of hedonistic states. And the third category of theories are eudaimonistic objectivist theories. So, of course, the first are the theories like Aristotle, the ancient theories, where there are certain internal goods like the virtues and certain external goods which are objectively good for us, which objectively lead to human flourishing. In a more modern context, in the mid-20th century, Abraham Maslow developed this hierarchy of needs, and that is essentially an objective list, objective criteria for what constitutes a good life. And you know, at the bottom, it's very sensible, sort of things like physiology, safety, and economic requirements and emotional requirements, and then higher states, self-actualization and transcendence. More recently, in positive psychology, we have the RIF 6-factor model of psychological well-being, which includes things like autonomy, environmental mastery, control over one's circumstances, personal growth, positive human relations, having a purpose in life, self-acceptance. And then Keyes and Fredrickson come up with an idea, a model of flourishing, which includes the 6-factor psychological well-being model, but also includes emotional well-being, essentially the subjective well-being, positive affect, low negative affect, and life satisfaction, and some measure of social well-being, how connected we are, how flourishing our relationships are, and of course not having any major depression. So this was used. And then a final one that is quite prevalent is Martin Seligman's PERMA model of well-being, which is positive, having positive emotions, engagement, something like exercising your capacities well, leading to a flow state, for example, engagement, relationships, meaning human relationships, meaning, having meaning in your life, and achievements. Now, let's see if we can try to see how we can put this together in a modern context. So, we said that there are some, the key for the ancients are some eudaimonistic factors, like having the virtues, so virtuous traits. And that is a message that comes through from the ancients and actually can be expanded in a more modern conception of what the virtues would be. So obviously virtues of appetite, like self-control, the appetitive parts of the self, having courage and fortitude, equanimity, which is kind of very coming from the Stoic and Buddhist ideas, moral virtue, compassion and kindness would be considered there on a more modern list, optimism and wisdom. So in addition, we had other factors which were considered to be, which we might think of as objectively good features of a life. Things like moral and economic autonomy. So not just economic, but also having political freedom. Having authentic friendships and loving relationships. A deeply important part of what it is to be human. Aristotle's basic insight that we are social animals. Accomplishments, fulfilling work through engaging with challenging tasks, earning the esteem of others, developing a deep understanding of ourselves and our world. So everything from science to a self-understanding. Aesthetic engagement, meaning and purpose, having goals that go beyond one's narrow self-interest. And transcendence, somehow going beyond a narrow conception of ourselves. So those would be the eudaimonistic factors of what constitutes human flourishing. And we split them out into these internal factors and external factors because, of course, we've understood that for some rather kind of hardcore philosophers like the Stoics, all you really needed was the internal factors, because that's what you had real control over in your life. The next grouping would be the factors of happiness. So short-term pleasure and pain, positive emotional states, a good mood, and life satisfaction. And then we would have the desire satisfaction theories. So fulfilling our goals and desires, or at least those preferences that were fully informed and were preferences that we would want to have. Now, how do these go together? What are the good makers? Well, what I want to show is that, in fact, we could start anywhere in this schema. Let's suppose that we think that the kind of eudaimonistic theories were right, and that having these virtuous traits and wisdom and equanimity and having adequate amounts of economic autonomy and friendships and meaning and beauty and truth in one's life led to the good life. Now that would be satisfying, as we saw from Mill and Aristotle himself. Those would lead to fine pleasures of a life well lived, would lead to a happiness. Now, since happiness is what we desire, what we end up doing is we would end up learning to desire those external and internal goods themselves. And so what we see is that we end up desiring the virtuous traits and the external goods. And so, in fact, in the good life, our desires would be satisfied. So that is a necessary condition in this kind of schema. So we suddenly find a causal network, but we could start from anywhere else. Suppose we started from happiness. What we think is absolutely makes life go well is happiness, but we would come to see that in fact the kind of things that make us happy are things on these lists. Having enough economic and moral autonomy, having equanimity and courage and optimism and wisdom are the kind of things that lead to a satisfied life and happiness. And therefore, again, we would come to desire those things because we desire our own happiness. We desire our life to go well. And similarly with desire satisfaction, you can say that what we desire is a satisfied life, and then we would come to empirically find that these objective features would be what we desire. But wherever you start, we can then conclude that in fact, human flourishing is a complex causal network of eudaimonistic factors, both states of the world, external goods, and states of mind, together with positive mental states, in this happiness box, and conative states, desire satisfactions. And this complex causal network, which is self-reinforcing, forms a virtuous cycle, and that's pun intended, virtuous cycle. And that virtuous cycle requires development and practice, developing the skills required. So we basically have Aristotle's insight that wherever we think we start with on these boxes, we will need to develop a virtuous cycle. And that development will require us to develop our virtues and traits and skills. And of course, from a modern perspective, developing the appropriate habits and thoughts and dispositions and equanimity will have signatures and correlates in the brain. We don't know what they are. They're not just simply the reward circuitry or the pleasure circuitry. They might be developing the appropriate attitude of equanimity or being less attached to our worldview. They might require, for example, quietening our most cherished beliefs about ourselves, our top-level priors of our models. They might require quietening our default mode network. We don't know what the signatures will be. And one of the wonderful things about this center is that that's precisely what we will be seeking to find out. So there will be mechanisms and methods like meditation, like Stoic therapy, like Stoic ideas, which will be ways to groove in these habits, groove in create these virtuous cycles and develop ourselves to groove into this complex causal network. And when we get this complex causal network flourishing and in a virtuous cycle, perhaps we'll end up like Master Yoda, who after 600 years really got a groove in his good life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamil, for that wonderful talk. Yeah, I think you managed to cover a lot of the ground, a lot of the things that I think will be at the very center of the center, if you like. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Anybody either here or online, just flag and I'll let you ask a question. We have two questions here. Please.
And mine is more of a comment than a question. Thank you. This is really impressive. And I was really kind of moved by this being happy in the torturous place idea. And made me think of the logotherapy of Viktor Frankl, where he actually managed to develop those virtues in a concentration camp. And yeah, it was a bit of a counterintuitive idea, but when you think about examples, it seems like it is, it's possible, and some people seem to be heading there. Yeah, I just want to comment.
Yeah, I think that's, so let me just repeat the question for those who didn't hear it online. I mean, more of a comment, really just linking the ideas of being happy on the rack, being tortured, to the ideas of logotherapy and Viktor Frankl. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, in fact, I think Frankl was quite influenced by these kind of Stoic ideas. And Frankl specifically, when you read that brilliant book, Man's Search for Meaning, that he has, he specifically talks about this. He says, in a concentration camp, you have no control over your external circumstances, and yet you can control your own attitude. And that ultimate freedom means that you can control the way you perceive the world. And in fact, I think it's very interesting because another modern example would be Admiral Stockdale, who I think just died a month or two ago. And he was tortured in the Vietnam War, and he used Stoic ideas precisely to say to resist this torture. And he's explicit about this. And so I think that I personally think that hardcore ideas, of Stoicism and Buddhism would be a similar kind of idea, to say, look, the only thing we really have control over is our own minds. But the problem is, most of us don't really have control over our own minds. However, we can learn to develop that control over your own mind. And if you do that, then you're immunized from the vagaries of the world, and not just in a sort of anesthetized way, but in a way that can make that you can come to see the world as beautiful, even when not so good things are happening. You can come to see that this is all a beautiful unfolding. So yeah, great.
It's not like what you said about what you said was really important. I think it's not also not going into the judgment. So if we start from the place that the concentration camp is bad for me, obviously where all of us would probably just go there immediately. It seems almost impossible to develop that type of attitude that you're describing. So
yeah.
Kind of non-judgment place.
Yeah, exactly. Suspending one's judgment. And this is in fact going back to pro-Harris, suspending your judgment. And that's ultimately, the Stoic serenity prayer starts from this, you first have to accept whatever's happening in the present moment, and then you see if you can do anything about it. And then, knowing the difference between whether you can and can't is wisdom.
Wonderful, thank you for that question. We have 4 questions online and 1 here, so I think we take 2 from online, and I think we'll start with Laura. Laura, please unmute.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation, which was, really rich of inputs and covered such a long period of Greek philosophy. I work on philology and etymology, so I have a question which is sort of etymologically related. The word arete, which is arete, which is virtue, yes, arete in Greek, is etymologically related to the word harma, which is chariot, wagon, and which is also, we have seen a recurrent image for describing the behavior, some behavioral patterns, or also self-control in Plato, for example. But it is also etymologically related to the word harmonia, harmony. So I was wondering if you had the opportunity, I don't know to which extent this falls in your interest, but to check how much Aristotle links the notion of virtue and harmonia, because you presented a series of passages in which he discussed this notion of the right balance. And also we know that, I mean, ancient Greece is a very aestheticizing aesthetic. There is always an aesthetic component in virtue. So it's very visible in Plato, but I was just wondering if you sort of looked into the term harmony in Aristotle, or like if he relates this notion of good balance and harmony. I don't know, is something that you checked, or I don't know, you would like to do? Because
yeah, it's very, very, very interesting. I mean, I hadn't, I didn't know about this etymological link, and it's very interesting. So I'll kind of reserve judgment on all that, on the actual etymological link, but on the kind of general point of harmony, I think it's a very good one. Of course, as you say, Plato uses harmony as his kind of key idea in what makes a life go well in the Republic, harmony in the soul. But to some extent, that is also echoed in Aristotle, and in fact, the idea is that there is a harmony between the virtues and what practical wisdom would want. And Aristotle almost comes to see this idea of Socrates, where the virtues are a unity, are one. Socrates has this idea that really all the virtues boil down to wisdom. And Aristotle actually explicitly echoes this in the Nicomachean Ethics, saying that ultimately Socrates is right, because all the virtues kind of conform with practical wisdom. So yeah, no, that's great. But look, on etymological things, I'll ask. Well, we have Roger Crisp, who's a great scholar. So maybe he will answer when he poses this question.
Thank you so much, Laura. And in fact, I think, Roger, it's your turn now. You could unmute.
Hi, Morten. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, Shamil. Thanks for a really fascinating lecture. I mean, well, I'm not sure we should get into questions of translation too deeply, but I think in a way, I had a couple of related questions, and the first one does sort of relate to the concepts in play. So
the concept of, sorry,
the concepts in play,
right?
So, one concept is this concept of eudaimonia, which you had right at the beginning, and then it comes up at the end as one of your factors. So, what's the relationship between eudaimonia, human flourishing, and well-being, or do you think they're all the same? That was one question. And then the second one was, of those three components, that you mentioned, the eudaimonistic factors, the positive mental states and the cognitive states, if I said to you, look, I mean, I take it that they are all, as it were, necessary and sufficient for human flourishing. But if I said to you, look, you can't have all three, so I want you to rank them from, most important to least important, how would you do it? Or do you think that question somehow is badly formed?
Okay, Roger, as your questions are absolutely brilliant, and like just cut to the heart of it. I think. Well, first of all, on the notion of eudaimonia and its relationship to human flourishing and human well-being, I introduced them as synonyms to begin with because we were considering Aristotle's idea, but I think you're absolutely right that in fact, by the end, the question that we're really thinking about is, what is human well-being? What makes life go well? And that may or may not, it's an open question to what extent that the answer to that question is eudaimonistic. So I think that I would say that the broadest notion is that I have is what makes life go well, and that everything should fall under that. But I think that that's absolutely right. Now, in your second question, I think this is a very, very interesting. I mean, obviously, Roger, you sort of recognize that the hint of this idea of all three of these types of theories being somehow necessary was there in Derek Parfit's, just in the last paragraph of Derek Parfit's Appendix I, and so in one way, you could say, well, look, if they're all kind of, if human flourishing is this groove, is all three of them standing up against each other. In other words, if it wouldn't really be a good life if you had the virtues but you didn't really desire them, or they didn't, you didn't get pleasure out of it, or something like that. So my first attempt would be to fall back to say, look, these three are supposed to be all necessary because a good life without satisfaction of if a good life, if you had all the eudaimonistic factors but you didn't really want them and you wanted other things, wouldn't really be a good life. But I want to actually come back to the spirit of your question, which is to say, let's say I can't rely on that complex causal network being the final thing, the sort of developmental process. This sort of developmentalism, which is kind of, Richard Kraut has a book on this kind of, this idea. If I can't rely on that, I would, of course, sort of show my own biases in a way by being relatively objectivist and eudaimonistic about things. My own view is that actually, sometimes I'm sort of quite hardcore Socratic and Stoic in these things to say, really, if one were to truly develop one's mental capacities well, then you will find that you go through life and it will be beautiful and full of well-being, and you'll want exactly the things that make you feel happy and develop these traits. So if you're asking me to put my cards on the table, I will put them down for the objective list theory, but with the objective list including, of course, sort of rather pragmatically, as Aristotle did, that pleasure is an integral part of a good life. I don't know if that's going to satisfy you.
Thanks very much, Shamil. That seems to be a very sensible response. I mean, I suppose I could ask you what you would choose if I took pleasure off the objective list, so you get everything else apart from pleasure.
I'll actually go further. I'll tell you, if you really ask me to be minimalist, there'll be two things that will be on my list: wisdom and equanimity, because it feels like everything else will come from there. It's sort of very Stoic, to be frank, I guess, and quite Socratic, I guess.
Okay, good, thank you.
This is certainly something we'll continue to discuss. I think. Thank you for that very good question. So we'll take one from the room. Petra, please.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the really motivating talk. I really liked it. So I have a quick comment and a question, completely unrelated. So the comment very quickly is I really like the complex network perspective on this, on these sort of different interrelated factors that they're not the same, but they sort of reinforce each other. It reminds me of a lot of recent frameworks of psychiatric disease that are sort of the other side of the coin. So I really like that. Now the actual question is, there's a very open-ended question. Most of the perspective you've presented of Eudaimonia in the talk seems to be very centered on the individual, on specific virtues that one can develop and train and practice, and what to do with what life gives you and whatnot. Could I ask to expand a bit more on the social dimensions of Eudaimonia? Like, do we have a moral obligation to provide external goods to others, or how does flourishing as a society look like?
I think that's an excellent question. In fact, I'm really glad you asked that. So for those who didn't hear the question, the account of Eudaimonia seems kind of individualistic, and to what extent is there a social dimension to this? And it's such an important question. And in fact, I'm really grateful because, in fact, Aristotle's idea was that actually the flourishing of the polis was the bigger thing. The flourishing of humanity or Gaia, or the planet, is the bigger thing. And that actually a flourishing state allows individuals to flourish, and they kind of reinforce each other. Now, the important thing is that the virtues include moral virtues. So justice, for example, is the typical. It's an ancient virtue which we might translate in our modern perspective as morality, treating others fairly, treating them fairly and well, and of course in this updated list that you see here, things like compassion and kindness are critically a part of that. I think that part of what it is in this broader conception of Eudaimonia is to see ourselves as part of something bigger, to have meaning in one's life, and having goals that go beyond oneself. So I do think that one of the reasons why I like this kind of virtue-based approach is that a purely hedonistic approach might seem as if it might be selfish. Actually, that's not right, because as many hedonistic philosophers like John Stuart Mill already concluded, possibly the worst thing you could do for your happiness is to be selfish and single-mindedly pursue your own happiness. Ironically. So I think that it's extremely important that I think that again I go back to Aristotle, amazingly wise about this, to see that really in some grand scheme, you could the flourishing of the individual supported the flourishing of the polis and vice versa. And in fact, this ancient Greek, the ancient approach was that in fact you couldn't flourish if you were ostracized. If you were exiled from Athens, that was it. It was no longer possible for you to flourish. Now, maybe the Stoics would have taken a different view to that, to say, no, whatever your circumstances. But in the kind of Plato and Aristotle's perspective, these external goods were important, and being part of a thriving, flourishing community in which we contribute. And it's kind of interesting to know that Aristotle kind of had two favorite lives. One was the life of the contemplative life, the life of the philosopher and scientist. And the other was the life of the practical life, the life of being an Athenian general who became a statesman, who contributed to life to public life, and fought for justice. So I think it's very much a part of it. And yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you. And I think we'll go to Barcelona now. I believe the group has a question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Shamil, for a fascinating talk. My question goes to how does nature as a genetical makeup kind of play part in kind of what you've been talking about? And I guess because the way I see it thus far, it's a lot of like a tabula rasa type of kind of like lofty goals, and like even the internal, like the Stoic or the Buddhist, which I think are very, very important, or kind of externally acting on the world. But I always feel that it would be constrained by, the individual genetical makeup that we are given, and whether you could say something more about that, whether you think it also plays part in the broader picture of.
Yeah, again, absolutely brilliant and very helpful to bring that up. When we start to update some of these ideas to in a modern context, because of course I'm sure you're all referring to the fact that we think maybe 40-50% of our happiness is influenced by our genetic disposition, for example, and I think that there's two parts of the question. One is individual differences, and then one is human nature. And I think you're talking about individual differences, if I get it right. And I think that the individual differences are actually very important practically for one's life. But the idea is that this developmentalist idea is that, well, we're all on a journey of developing the mental traits and dispositions which allow us to flourish. And for some, it may be harder or more difficult than others. Oddly enough, I'm not actually sure that having difficulties is in fact a disadvantage. I mean, this is a very strange thing, but in fact, it could be that, having difficulties is a spur to develop these kind of traits of resilience and equanimity. And that's often what was found. Nietzsche once said, he wished difficulties upon his friends, and that's not because he was a nasty fellow, but it was because he realized that through difficulties we sublimate and develop ourselves. So I think it's a great question that individual differences are super important, and then how that influences what the good life looks like is also a very important thing, because in a sense, what we want is a pluralistic account of what makes life go well, which is dependent on your particular characteristics. For example, someone with athletic abilities that develops them well, that might be a part of their, what constitutes their human flourishing, whereas someone else might have musical abilities or artistic abilities. And so, you want this kind of pluralistic account, which does depend. So I really that's a very helpful question that you have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Genetic and developmental question. which I think is another angle that we'll be hoping to explore. And then I think we'll go to Chile. Fernando has a question. Please.
Thank you, Morten, and thank you, Shamil, for the wonderful presentation and conversation. I have a question about this causal diagram that I find fascinating. If I just see this diagram and I know nothing about the world, I would think that this is easy. Like everybody should be doing this. This looks like you have an attractor, and the more you circle, the better you are, and the world is becoming better for sure. But that's not what is happening usually. So could you spend some words on your thoughts on why this diagram can fail? Because nobody is pursuing unhappiness. Yeah. But somehow many of us get it on a regular basis.
No, absolutely. No, this is a great question. And first of all, in terms of the diagram, in the last couple of days, as I was doing my slides, I should say, should I put all the other arrows on? Because I've only showed the arrows from one party, but actually, when you look at the full feedback loop of happiness affecting virtues and various things, it becomes a really complicated spider's web. But you've got the concept right in the sense that the good life is the attractor. But the question that you say, which is I think really good, which is that, oh, well, then surely you fall into the orbit, wherever you are, you fall into the orbit of the attractor set. I mean, I love it because we're both dynamical theorists, and so we're using differential equation ideas. Okay, so you fall into this attractor basin. But as you said, quite rightly say, that doesn't seem to happen. And that's interesting, which means to say that, the attractor basin may not be that neat as you go further out. It might be valleys and lands and mountains and wrong valleys, and people get into addiction, which takes them down this local equilibria somewhere into a terrible place, and all sorts of things. And we develop selfish attitudes rather than generous ones, for example, and all sorts of things like this. So I think that, again, falling back on Aristotle's amazing wisdom was that actually in this kind of account, it really helps to be the way Aristotle would. It sounds rather quaint now, but the way he might have put it is, it really helps to be brought up well. In other words, from an early age, develop and cultivate those traits and habits which start to groove us into the right way. And in fact, that's precisely what Aristotle says. In fact, he says that that's even more important than wisdom initially. Initially, you want to be kind of inculcated into the virtues, and then in a later stage, you learn about the wisdom and start to think philosophically and all this kind of thing. And the project for Aristotle, in the words of another philosopher, contemporary philosopher, Miles Bernier, the idea is learning to be good. The way you learn to be good is initially, you're told by your parents, share your Star Wars toy with your sister, otherwise you won't get this, prize or something. You won't get to have ice cream, and then you kind of get habituated into it, and then slowly, as you go through university, you learn, there's all this wisdom that I have to learn as well. So I totally agree that in fact, just as in childhood development, these things are a matter of cultivation. And if you just look at our culture, and Eastern cultures and Western cultures and traditional cultures, you see that there's a lot of time spent on inculcating these values, whatever the values of the culture are, which are supposed to be conducive to the good life. And you might say, well, and a lot of those were presented as if they were objective features. So rather objective features. It's a very modern thing to have this very subjective turn, which is to say, whatever you want. If you spending 12 hours on the iPad is good for your flourishing, do it. And that maybe is not going out so well. So, great question.
Well, thank you so much, Shamil. I think we've opened a lot of new avenues. You've answered and given us a lot of food for thought. I thought I'd just end with